You're sleeping. You're functioning. You're getting through your responsibilities. Nothing is collapsing. And yet, you feel tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. You wake up and you're already slightly heavy. Not depressed. Not in crisis. Just drained. You tell yourself it's burnout. That seems logical. You're busy. You're productive. You're carrying obligations. Burnout makes sense. But look closer. Burnout usually follows overexertion. Long hours. Relentless stress. Clear overload. But what if you're not overworking? What if you're simply misaligned? There's a difference. Burnout is physical depletion from output exceeding capacity. Misalignment is psychological depletion from living in contradiction. And contradiction consumes energy quietly. Carl Jung repeatedly observed that symptoms often arise not from external workload, but from inner division. When the ego commits to a path the deeper self cannot support, tension accumulates. That tension does not always appear as anxiety. Sometimes it appears as fatigue. You may be productive, disciplined, even successful, but something feels slightly off. You can't name it clearly. It's not dramatic dissatisfaction. It's subtle friction. You complete tasks, but they don't energize you. You attend meetings, but you feel internally distant. You engage in conversations, but you feel slightly disconnected from your own responses. Nothing is wrong, and that's what makes it confusing. If something were clearly wrong, you could fix it, but this isn't crisis. It's misalignment. Think about how your day actually feels. Do you feel physically exhausted from exertion or mentally heavy from repetition? There's a difference between muscle fatigue and identity fatigue. Identity fatigue occurs when your outer structure no longer reflects your evolving inner state. Jung spoke extensively about the conflict between the persona and the self. The persona is who you've learned to be in order to function. The self represents the deeper totality of who you are becoming. When the persona continues moving in one direction while the self pulls in another, energy drains. Not explosively, gradually. For example, you may be working in a role that once made sense. It matched your earlier ambitions. It satisfied expectations. It earned approval. But internally, something has shifted. Your values have refined. Your tolerance for superficiality has decreased. Your need for meaning has intensified, yet your daily behavior remains the same. That gap between internal evolution and external structure creates tension, and tension, sustained over time, feels like exhaustion. You might say, but I'm not unhappy. Misalignment does not always produce obvious unhappiness. It produces dull depletion, a sense that you are expending energy in the wrong direction. You finish a full day and instead of feeling accomplished, you feel emptied, not because you worked too hard, but because you worked against your own psychological current. Jung once wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." That sentence is often misunderstood. He meant that when we refuse necessary change, when we avoid confronting misalignment, the psyche produces symptoms instead. Fatigue can be one of those symptoms. Instead of grieving that your current life structure no longer fits, you call it burnout. Instead of acknowledging that your identity has shifted, you blame productivity. It's easier to say, "I'm overworked." It's harder to say, "I'm living in contradiction." Misalignment is subtle at first. You begin tolerating things you once questioned. You say yes to commitments that feel slightly off. You maintain routines that no longer reflect who you are becoming. And because nothing is catastrophic, you continue. But internally, something resists. That resistance requires energy. Imagine holding two opposing beliefs simultaneously. I should be grateful for this. I don't feel aligned with this. That internal split creates friction. Friction consumes psychological energy. You might notice physical signals. A low-level tension in your chest. A heaviness in the morning. A sense of relief when plans cancel. Not because you hate people. Not because you're lazy. But because cancellation temporarily reduces contradiction. You may feel most energized when you're alone. Not because you want isolation, but because solitude reduces performance. In solitude, persona relaxes. The ego doesn't have to maintain a role. And when the role drops, energy stabilizes. This is a critical distinction. Burnout feels like you've done too much. Misalignment feels like you've done too much of the wrong thing, even if that wrong thing looks respectable from the outside. Jung warned that if we ignore the signals of the psyche, the unconscious will correct us, often through symptoms. Chronic fatigue without clear overload can be a signal, not of weakness, but of misdirection. You may also notice irritability creeping in. Small tasks feel heavier. Minor inconveniences feel disproportionate. That irritability is not necessarily about stress. It may be about suppressed redirection. A part of you wants change, but the ego resists because change disrupts structure. So instead of restructuring your life, you push through, and pushing through consumes energy. This is especially common during individuation. When your inner world evolves faster than your outer life, your career may reflect who you were 5 years ago. Your relationships may reflect roles you've outgrown. Your daily habits may reflect survival strategies that no longer serve you. But externally, everything still functions. So you assume the problem is endurance. You try to rest more, sleep more, optimize more. But rest does not fix contradiction. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up misaligned, because the fatigue is not muscular. It's existential. That doesn't mean dramatic life changes are required immediately, but it does mean honest examination is necessary. Where are you acting out of obligation rather than alignment? Where are you maintaining an image that no longer fits? Where are you continuing simply because it once made sense? Jung described the process of individuation as becoming who you are meant to be, not who you were conditioned to perform. When the persona remains rigid while the self evolves, exhaustion is inevitable, not as punishment, as feedback. Your body becomes a messenger. It whispers first, through subtle fatigue, through reduced enthusiasm, through diminished vitality. If ignored, it grows louder, through resentment, through disengagement, through collapse. But in early stages, it feels like this: I'm tired, but I don't know why. That confusion is important, because if you mislabel as burnout, you treat the wrong cause. You rest instead of realign. You reduce output instead of adjusting direction. Realignment is not dramatic reinvention. It often begins with small corrections. Saying no to what feels slightly false. Adjusting how you spend your time. Reevaluating what you are building and why. But before those corrections, recognition must occur. You are not necessarily exhausted because you are doing too much. You may be exhausted because you're doing what no longer matches who you are becoming. And the psyche resists prolonged self-betrayal. Not loudly, quietly, through fatigue, through dullness, through subtle internal friction. The question is not, how do I push through this? The deeper question is, where am I out of alignment with myself? Because if misalignment is the source, endurance will not solve it. Only adjustment will. And that adjustment begins with recognizing that this is not weakness. It is information. Information from the deeper layers of your psyche. Information, Jung would say, should never be ignored, because the self does not disappear. It signals. And sometimes it signals through exhaustion. Burnout feels like overload. Misalignment feels like resistance. They can look similar on the surface, but internally, they are very different experiences. When you are burned out, you feel overused. When you are misaligned, you feel divided. Division is heavier than effort. You can work long hours on something that feels meaningful and still have energy left, but you can work moderate hours on something that contradicts you and feel depleted. Why? Because contradiction consumes more energy than labor. Carl Jung observed that psychological suffering often emerges when the ego's chosen direction conflicts with the deeper movement of a self. He did not see symptoms as random malfunctions. He saw them as signals that the personality had become one-sided. One-sidedness creates tension, and sustained tension creates fatigue. You may tell yourself, this is just adulthood, responsibilities, stability, structure. But there is a difference between responsibility and self-betrayal. Responsibility feels heavy but meaningful. Self-betrayal feels dull and draining. For example, you may be maintaining a professional identity that once felt ambitious. You built it carefully. It earned approval. It gave you status. But internally, your values have shifted. You crave depth over performance, integrity over impression, meaning over momentum. Yet your daily behavior still serves the old identity. That gap is not loud, but it is constant, and constant low-level tension exhausts you more than acute stress ever could. Jung spoke about the danger of over-identifying with the persona. When the persona becomes a primary identity, the individual drifts away from the self. At first, this drift feels productive. You succeed, you function, you appear stable. But over time, vitality decreases. Because the self is not being consulted, it is being overridden. The psyche tolerates this for a while. Then it signals, not always through breakdown, sometimes through flatness, through reduced enthusiasm, through waking up without internal momentum. You might notice this especially on weekends or days off. You are not working, yet you still feel tired. There is no urgent task, yet your body feels heavy. If it were pure burnout, rest would restore you. If it is misalignment, rest only pauses the friction. The friction returns when the structure resumes. This is why vacations sometimes don't fix the exhaustion. You leave, you decompress, you feel temporary relief. Then you return to the same structure, and the heaviness reappears. Because the issue was never output alone. It was direction. Jung wrote extensively about the call of the self. He believed that as a person matures, the psyche pushes toward greater wholeness. If that call is ignored, neurosis develops. Neurosis, in his view, was not weakness. It was a misalignment between the conscious life and the deeper inner movement. In modern language, we might call it chronic fatigue. Without clear cause, you may also feel restless. Not in a dramatic way, just slightly unsatisfied. You complete milestones. You achieve goals. You check boxes. And yet the satisfaction fades quickly. That fading is not greed. It is misdirection. When achievement serves a persona but not the self, it lacks nourishment. It looks impressive, but it doesn't replenish you. There is also emotional dissonance. You say you're grateful, and you are, but you also feel detached. You tell yourself, I shouldn't complain, and you don't, but the body keeps signaling. Subtle irritability, low motivation, difficulty initiating tasks you once handled easily. The ego interprets this as laziness, but laziness rarely produces internal conflict. Misalignment does. The ego wants to preserve structure. The self wants coherence. When those two diverge, energy leaks. Imagine driving with the brakes slightly engaged. You're still moving, but resistance increases fuel consumption. Living out of alignment feels like that. You're progressing externally, but internally, resistance is constant. You may also notice increased sensitivity to environments. Workplaces feel louder. Superficial conversations feel heavier. Performative spaces feel exhausting. Earlier, you tolerated them easily. Now your tolerance is lower. That's not fragility. It's refinement. As individuation progresses, the psyche becomes less willing to sustain environments that contradict inner truth. Jung believed that midlife in particular intensifies this tension. The first half of life is often about adaptation, building career, reputation, structure. The second half demands integration, aligning outer life with inner truth. If adaptation continues without integration, symptoms arise. Fatigue can be one of them, not dramatic collapse, just ongoing depletion. Another indicator of misalignment is loss of meaning without loss of function. You still perform, but the internal why feels faded. And without a living why, energy declines, because meaning generates vitality. Persona generates performance. Performance without meaning exhausts. You may also find yourself fantasizing about simplicity, not escape, just congruence, waking up without tension, working without contradiction, speaking without filtering. These fantasies are not laziness. They are signals of the psyche seeking alignment. But alignment often requires confronting something uncomfortable, a career adjustment, a relational boundary, a structural reevaluation, and the ego resists that because change threatens stability. So instead, you try to optimize productivity. You improve routines, track habits, increase discipline. But discipline cannot resolve inner contradiction. It can only sustain it longer. Eventually, the body intervenes through fatigue, through lack of motivation, through subtle disengagement. Jung would argue that this is not malfunction, it is compensation. The unconscious compensates for conscious imbalance. If your conscious life overemphasizes image, the unconscious reduces vitality. If your conscious goals ignore deeper values, the unconscious creates friction. The psyche seeks balance. When balance is ignored, energy declines. So ask yourself honestly, if you removed external expectations, what would feel different? Not in fantasy, in structure. Would you still choose the same pace? The same commitments? The same direction? If the answer hesitates, misalignment may be present. This does not mean immediate upheaval. It means awareness, because awareness is a first step toward realignment. You are not weak for feeling tired. You may simply be divided, and division is heavier than effort. The fatigue you call burnout may be your psyche asking for coherence, not rest alone, but reorientation. Jung believed that ignoring the self leads to increasing symptoms. Listening to it leads to integration. Integration restores vitality, not instantly, but progressively. Because when inner truth and outer life move in the same direction, resistance decreases. And when resistance decreases, energy returns. Not dramatically, but steadily. The question is no longer, how do I recover faster? The question becomes, what part of my life no longer reflects who I am becoming? That is a harder question, but it is the right one. Because endurance without alignment only deepens exhaustion. Alignment, even in small adjustments, restores psychological energy at its source. If this isn't burnout, then the solution isn't just rest. It's alignment. But alignment does not begin with dramatic life changes. It begins with honesty, not public honesty, private honesty. You don't need to quit your job tomorrow. You don't need to dismantle your entire life structure. You need to identify where friction lives. Start small. Where do you consistently override yourself? Where do you say yes when your body says no? Where do you continue routines that feel slightly false? Misalignment is rarely one catastrophic decision. It is accumulated micro-betrayals. And micro-betrayals drain energy. Jung believed that individuation is a gradual alignment between ego and self. The ego organizes daily life. The self represents the totality of who you are becoming. When the ego refuses to update its direction as the self evolves, exhaustion appears. So realignment is not rebellion. It is recalibration. You may begin noticing subtle shifts. You stop volunteering for tasks that feel empty. You adjust how much emotional labor you offer in relationships. You speak more honestly in low-stakes conversations. These changes feel small, but small congruent actions reduce inner division, and reduced division restores energy. For example, if you are in a role that no longer fits entirely, you may not be able to leave immediately, but you can change how you relate to it. You can clarify boundaries. You can reduce unnecessary performance. You can remove self-imposed pressure. Each correction decreases friction. Alignment is not always external. It is often internal posture. Are you working for validation or from values? Are you staying in conversations to maintain image or because they feel meaningful? Even subtle motivation shifts matter because energy follows meaning. Jung warned that when we ignore our deeper calling, the psyche produces symptoms to force attention. But he also emphasized that integration restores vitality. When ego and self cooperate, energy flows more naturally. You've likely experienced this before. A conversation that felt fully honest. A project that felt aligned with your curiosity. A decision that felt clean in your body. Notice how your energy felt afterward. Not hyper, not euphoric. Steady, clear. That steadiness is alignment. It doesn't create adrenaline. It creates durability. There is also something important to accept. Realignment may disappoint parts of your old identity. If you built your life around achievement, slowing down may feel threatening. If you built your life around being reliable, setting limits may feel selfish. If you built your life around being agreeable, speaking honestly may feel disruptive. The ego fears losing structure, but individuation always restructures identity gradually. Jung described this as a tension between opposites, the old you and the emerging you, security and authenticity, approval and integrity. That tension cannot be avoided, but it can be negotiated consciously. The mistake is assuming you must choose instantly. You don't. You adjust gradually. One honest conversation, one boundary clarified, one unnecessary commitment released. Over time, these shifts accumulate, and something subtle happens. The morning heaviness decreases. The low-grade irritability softens. Motivation returns in small waves because the psyche no longer feels split. Alignment does not eliminate responsibility. It makes responsibility meaningful. You may still work hard, still fulfill obligations, but the inner contradiction lessens. And with less contradiction, energy stabilizes. There will still be tired days. Human beings have limits, but tiredness from effort feels different than tiredness from misalignment. Effort fatigue feels clean. Misalignment fatigue feels dull. When you begin correcting direction, the dullness fades first. Clarity replaces confusion. You may also notice increased courage. Not loud courage, quiet courage. The courage to say, this no longer fits. The courage to restructure gradually. The courage to disappoint expectations that no longer align with your evolution. Jung believed that failing to answer the call of the self results in stagnation. Answering it results in integration. Integration does not promise constant excitement. It promises coherence. And coherence is energizing because you're no longer expending energy holding contradictions in place. The goal is not to abandon your life. It is to bring your life into conversation with your inner development. Ask yourself, if I adjusted one area of misalignment this month, what would it be? Not everything. One area, one pattern, one routine. Start there. Alignment is cumulative. Each honest adjustment reduces resistance. Each reduction in resistance restores vitality. You are not lazy. You are not fragile. You are likely divided. And division is exhausting. But division can be resolved gradually through conscious restructuring, through ego humility, through listening to the signals instead of overriding them. Burnout asks for rest. Misalignment asks for truth. Rest helps temporarily. Truth restores permanently, not dramatically, but steadily. And steady restoration is what individuation actually feels like. Not all exhaustion is physical. Some of it is psychological. And psychological exhaustion rarely comes from effort alone. It comes from living too long in contradiction. You can be disciplined, responsible, reliable, and still feel depleted. Because the question is not how much you're doing. The question is whether what you are doing reflects who you are becoming. Carl Jung believed that when the ego ignores the direction of the self, symptoms emerge, not to punish you, but to correct you. The psyche does not tolerate prolonged misalignment without signaling. Sometimes it signals through anxiety, sometimes through restlessness, and sometimes through fatigue that rest does not repair. If you sleep and still wake up heavy, it may not be burnout. It may be inner division. The outer life moving one way, the inner life pulling another, and that split consumes energy quietly. You are not weak for feeling tired. You may simply be evolving faster internally than your external structure allows. Individuation demands periodic restructuring, not dramatic collapse, not impulsive reinvention, but honest recalibration. Where am I performing who I used to be? Where am I maintaining a life that no longer fits my current values? Where am I enduring what I could gradually adjust? Alignment does not require chaos. It requires courage. The courage to admit that something once right may no longer be true. And when you begin adjusting, even in small ways, energy returns, not in excitement, in steadiness. Because when ego and self move in the same direction, resistance decreases, And when resistance decreases, vitality restores itself naturally. You don't need to force yourself to be stronger. You may need to live more coherently. Exhaustion is not always a sign to rest. Sometimes it is a sign to realign. Listen carefully. Your fatigue may not be weakness. It may be wisdom asking for structural honesty.